Budget Partnership. Adil Ababu of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and I are delighted to moderate this session today in collaboration with the African Forum for Debt and Development, AFRODAD, Red Latinoamericana por Justicia Económica y Social, LatinDad, the Center for Global Development, and the Open Society Foundations. We recognize there are variable levels of engagement with the topic of SDRs. So let's begin with a poll to get a sense of how familiar we are with the topic of SDRs. We'll kick off with a poll. So how familiar are you with the SDRs? It's all new to me, somewhat aware of it, actively engaging in policy discussions. Great, well, it's great to learn about the participants today. We have participants from around the world and from various sectors and organizations. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's a nice mix of familiarity with the topic, so we hope you'll find the session interesting. The main objectives of the event today are to unpack the policy implications created by the SDR allocations, foster peer learning, and identify opportunities to promote equitable and accountable use of this additional financial capacity. As many of you know, the IMF allocated to all countries in the world the equivalent of $650 billion worth of SDRs last August, of which $275 billion is going to emerging and developing countries. While this is the most significant injection of resources to support countries' economic recovery from the pandemic, we suspect that it has stayed below the radar. So ultimately, we think that it's very important that civil society actors are more aware of what is happening and have a role to play in influencing the use of SDRs. We have an opportunity to direct attention to those available resources and ensure they are used in a transparent, equitable, and accountable manner. So against this backdrop, we have a packed agenda for you today. We have a panel of experts who are actively engaging on SDRs at the national and international level. And we'll then invite questions from the audience, followed by lively discussions. So please do use the chat to share your reflections, your questions, and ideas. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Claire. As Claire just pointed out, SDRs represent a significant addition of potential resources for countries. Country allocation have represented over 10% of GDP in 14 countries. In 3 of these, which are Liberia, South Sudan, and Zambia, SDR would top 20% of GDP. It would cover at least 5% of GDP for another 13 countries. To give a sense of this magnitude, the average spending on health in sub-Saharan Africa represents 6.1% of its GDP. So that's pretty significant. And this shot in the arm, as was coined by the IMF, was often not anticipated by recipient countries and can be described as additional resources against the national budget. And despite that, we hear from our partners that there have been little engagement between governments and civil society regarding the use of SDRs. Such engagement are not helped really by the fact that SDR are not the most straightforward financing tool, but also that there have been little engagement between government and civil society regarding the use of SDR. So we hope that this debate over the use of SDR would kick off today, that this conversation will be a way for us to start closing the accountability gap regarding the use of SDRs, both by learning about the specificities and the various ways civil society organizations have acted around the world. So let me turn now to our 4 speakers today. It's my pleasure to introduce Mark Plant, who's CGD, Center for Global Development, Co-Director of Development Finance, and Senior Policy Fellow. Prior to that, Mark had a long career at the IMF, including as a senior member of its Africa and Strategy, Policy and Review departments. Mark and his team at CGD have been at the forefront of the SDR debate and have produced multiple analyses to enrich and clarify the discussion, which I'll share in the chat. We could not be with a better person to clarify what SDRs mean for countries' finance and the potential approaches to convert them into fiscal spending. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Adil, and thank you to both you and Claire for that kind introduction. The Center for Global Development is proud to be a co-sponsor of this event alongside many other distinguished institutions, and I'm pleased to be able to lead off the discussion today. In my presentation, I want to lay out some of the defining characteristics of SDRs and talk about the challenges that we will all confront in ensuring the recent allocation of $650 billion worth of SDRs is indeed well used. Next slide. To understand how we will account for SDRs, we need to understand what they are. An SDR is a reserve asset issued by the IMF to each of its 190 member countries. It's a claim on any of the IMF's reserve currencies: dollars, yen, euro, pound sterling, or renminbi. Right now, one SDR can be exchanged for $1.41 or £1, 2 pence. These exchanges are made between member countries of the IMF. For example, if Ghana's central bank is short on dollars, it can ask that some of its SDRs be exchanged for dollars. The IMF then finds a country willing to take Ghana's SDRs and give Ghana's dollars. The IMF itself plays only an intermediary role in matching buyers and sellers. And it's important to note, as you have policy discussions in various countries, the owner of SDRs varies within each country. While they're held at the central bank in the central bank's accounts, sometimes they belong to the government, sometimes they'll belong to the central bank, and sometimes to yet another entity. So who decides what to do with SDRs will vary across countries. Next slide. It's important to realize that SDRs are not money. They can't be used to buy or sell anything directly. So what can countries do with SDRs that are sitting in their central banks? First, they can hold them as reserves at the central bank. This is an important function, as foreign exchange reserves provide a needed cushion to ensure the smooth functioning of the economy during difficult times. And many vulnerable countries' reserves have been eroded during the pandemic. So building these reserves back up gives countries more room to maneuver and more confidence in executing their economic policies. Second, SDRs can be used to pay debts to other designated holders of SDRs. Each of the IMF's 190 member countries can hold SDRs in their account at the IMF. And so can 15 designated institutions like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the ECB, and the Latin American Reserve Fund. If a country is indebted to another country or to one of the multilateral development banks, that debt can be paid in SDRs if both parties are willing. Third, SDRs can be lent or donated to other countries. For example, France could give some of its SDRs to Burkina Faso. This would increase Burkina Faso's reserves and decrease France's. This so-called reallocation process is under intense discussion in the international community, with many arguing that rich countries don't really need their new SDRs, and they should help out vulnerable countries by transferring SDRs to them. That's not the subject of today's seminar, so I won't go into details about how these transfers might come about, but it is a possibility for countries to engage that way. Fourth, a country can decide to convert its SDRs to usable currency. As I described before, SDRs can be exchanged for hard currency, as we call it. And then once it's exchanged, the country can spend the SDRs on real commodities: vaccines, imports of food supplies, imports of investment inputs like cement or solar panels. So that's an actual mobilizing the SDRs into hard currency, into something concrete. But there's an important warning here that the use of SDRs is not free. Each country has what's called an Str Allocation, which is the number of SDRs that's been given by the IMF since SDRs were established in 1968. It holds those SDRs in an account at the IMF that's termed its holdings. When a country uses its SDRs, its holdings drop below its allocation, and the country has to pay interest on that deficit. If a country receives SDRs from another country, say in payment of a debt, its holdings may exceed its allocation, and then it receives interest on the excess holdings. The interest rate right now is 0.05%. That's 0.0005. So it's very low, much lower than the cost of borrowing dollars or euros on the open market, especially for vulnerable countries with low credit ratings. So the use of SDRs could be an attractive option when countries need hard currency. But their use of SDRs, the cost has to be weighed against other potential costs. Before I talk about some of the problems or some of the challenges in looking at the accounting of SDRs, I want to give you a bit of information about how you can find information on SDRs, what the holdings are, what the allocations are, what the transactions are. And it turns out it isn't easy. The IMF has in fact promised to publish more information and more frequent information than in the past. And you can see what they've promised in the first link that I have on this page. And we'll put these links in the chat and be circulated after the talk, so you'll have access to them. If you want to know the current and historical allocation and holdings of any country's SDRs, you can click on the second link on this page, and then on the year and the month that you're interested in, and you'll get a full list of all countries' allocations and holdings. And all this information can be downloaded as well, the entire history since 1968, month by month. Transactions in SDRs, that is exchanges between countries right now, is impossible to track, but should be more trackable in the future, according to the IMF. But some information can be deduced from the data available at these links that I've given you. Let me give you an example. Next screen, please. This chart shows the changes in country SDR positions between the end of August and the end of September 2021. As you can see, Argentina at the very top of the page has reduced its holdings of SDRs substantially by almost $1.9 billion worth. And for every seller of SDRs, there must be a buyer, because SDR exchanges are made between countries. And you can see some countries increase their holdings of SDRs, Australia and China, for example. Other big sellers in the last month have been Ecuador, Lebanon, Ukraine, and Tunisia. All these sellers make sense for their countries that are in deep economic crisis and need hard currency to pay for imports and to pay off debt. What you can't tell from the chart is who bought what SDRs from whom. At this point, the IMF keeps that kind of information confidential, but you can make some deductions about how the gross flows month to month, year to year are going. Next slide, please. So in analyzing how SDRs are being used, there are several considerations that we have to take into account as we look at what governments do with SDRs. First, SDRs are fungible with other reserves. Say a country owes money to the World Bank. It can pay in dollars or it can pay in SDRs. The new SDR allocation gives it flexibility in how it makes those payments and what it does with its other reserves. So in order to understand what added flexibility the country is gaining, you need to look at the overall reserve management of a country's central bank, not just its SDR flows. Second, the ability of the SDRs to increase fiscal space or budgetary room is somewhat limited. SDRs can increase import power. Suppose the government of an island country, say Mauritius, that has a tourism-based economy, had a solar energy product in plans before the pandemic. But when the pandemic came along, they had to put the energy project on hold because the pandemic cut off tourism receipts, and they didn't have enough dollars coming into the country to buy the solar panels for the energy product. With the SDRs in the reserve account of the Central Bank of Mauritius, the government now has more room. They have access to foreign exchange, and they can use those SDRs to facilitate that purchase of solar panels from abroad. So SDRs are very good for increasing government's import power. But SDRs can't be used to pay teacher salaries, for example, in Mauritius. The SDRs would have to be converted to dollars, then to the local currency, and that would be an injection of local currency into the economy, which is essentially like creating money. This may have unintended macroeconomic effects like inflation, depending on how the economy is being managed. So the domestic spending of SDRs is a bit more difficult to do and requires careful attention from policymakers and analysts alike. Third, SDRs can facilitate international trade that takes place outside the government. Take the same solar project I was talking about in Mauritius before, but suppose rather than being a government project, it was a private company that was doing the project. Because of the pandemic, the central bank might have said to the company, sorry, we can't give you any foreign exchange. We're short on dollars. You can't complete your project. Lots of such strict restrictions were imposed in the last year around the world. The SDRs may give the central bank the maneuvering room to allow that private company to restart its project. So the impact of SDRs could be seen not just within the government, but within the economy as a whole. So you have to look wider than the budget to understand how SDRs are being used for economic purposes. Finally, as we look at how SDRs might be used by the government and the central bank, we need to keep in mind that SDRs, as I said before, do have an interest cost that has to be paid. And it will be important to know how the government intends to pay that cost, even if it's low right now. That SDR interest rate can increase over time. It's a market-based rate. And so governments have to be aware that as they spend their SDRs, they are incurring a future interest liability. And it has to understand what the cost of using SDRs are compared to the cost of using other reserves for similar purposes. There are really three messages. It's a complicated thing, tracking SDRs, but I'd like you to remember these three messages. First of all, SDRs are not money. They're a claim on money, and they have to be converted to money. And that process has to take place within the central banks of the world. And so you have to understand that process in order to understand how SDRs are going to work. Secondly, SDRs can be useful even if you don't see that they're directly spent. They can help economic policy of the government. They can help give flexibility to economic policy of the government. They can help the private sector execute its plans. So you have to look more widely at the economic policies of the government and the economy as a whole to understand how SDRs are being used. And third, the information on SDRs from the IMF is somewhat limited. I think we as a community who are interested in the use of SDRs are going to have to work together to collect and interpret IMF and country data to understand exactly how SDRs are helping vulnerable countries, and push a bit at the IMF to be more transparent about what they see the transactions and other uses of SDRs are. Let me stop at that. Thank you very much.
Mark, thanks so much. You certainly highlighted some of the transparency and accountability challenges and opportunities, of course, that we have together to collect that data, push for the transparency of transactions, and looking forward to working together on interpreting that data and calling for greater accountability. Thanks so much. We now pass to Andres Aruz, who's a senior research fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and of course, a rich background in politics in Ecuador as well. As a former senior official at the Central Bank of Ecuador, Andres, you'll clarify today that relationship between government and central banks when it comes to SDRs, and why the debate over the use of SDRs should not sit strictly with the central bank. So over to you, Andres. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and all the organizers for the invitation. I'd like to present today this handbook for the use of SDRs for fiscal purposes. I think this is perhaps one of the most important challenges this year and next year for the developing world after a landmark decision this August by the members of the IMF to issue $650 billion worth of SDRs. Although I always say, you know, we should only count as the headline number the amount that goes to developing countries, because the rich developed countries mostly have no use for them except to perhaps rechannel them or donate them back to the countries of the South. In this case, I will focus on accounting and transparency implications in a work that I did together with Latin Data earlier this year. So just to put a regional focus on this, in the whole of the Latin American and Caribbean region, we received around $51 billion worth of SDRs, with the exception of Venezuela, because of political reasons, their assets have been frozen at the IMF and they cannot have access to their SDRs. But these amounts are substantial and significant for Central American, Caribbean countries, and in general, countries of Latin America. They are an important injection of liquidity or potential liquidity for the domestic economies if used wisely. Now, we have to understand that the SDRs, even though they're a monetary instrument, they're a financial instrument designed by the IMF a long time ago and long since forgotten, is now facing a revival. But it's facing a revival in the context of a pandemic, which was declared on March 12, 2020. However, only 17 months later were the SDRs issued. This is an important thing, because it means that it's not a short-term response, unlike the monetary issuance, the quantitative easings and the outright monetary purchases and so on that developed countries did react with earlier last year. Furthermore, the pandemic is a biological and a health-related phenomenon. It's not a monetary one. This is not, your typical financial crisis or your balance of payments crisis that requires a monetary response. This is another type of crisis, a real-world type of crisis, which requires a fiscal response, right? We need to give biological health and economic recovery type measures. This is not just a liquidity crisis, this is a solvency crisis because people have been locked in their houses. They have not been able to work. They have not been able to sell. The supply chains have been broken. The production processes have been fragmented and so on. So response has to be in the real world, not just in the monetary sphere. Now, however, because of all of this, unfortunately, there's still a large asymmetry in how the fiscal responses have been around the world. Rich countries have planned over the last year, this year, and beyond, over 16% of GDP in spending measures. I'm talking about fiscal spending here. While emerging market economies mostly injected fiscal spending last year, but very little this year, that amounts to less than 4% of GDP. Not to mention low-income countries, which hasn't even reached 2% of GDP, including all of last year. The SDR injection that you see in a shaded blue would only be this much, right? Only about a little more than 1% of GDP for developing countries. This shows that even though it's important, 1% of GDP is definitely not marginal, but it doesn't compare to the magnitude of perhaps what is needed in terms of fiscal response. But if we don't even use it for fiscal purposes, if it remains stashed away in central bank reserves, this will not even become help for these national economies. Now, stash or spend, sort of save it in the central bank's balance sheet or use them for the domestic economies. What does the IMF say? Sure, they have a guidance issued, which is sort of ambiguous. They say that it can be used for spending, but here's what the IMF spokespeople have said. The IMF chief economist, Jita Gopinath, said in a blog that, in the IMF official blog, that they should be used to help address essential spending needs of the population of developing countries. Jerry Rice, the IMF spokesman, said that they should be used to create room for urgent priority spending and support better policies. And Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, used an example of Lebanon to say that they have to be used and deployed for the maximum benefits of the country and its people. And the use of SDRs is, of course, a sovereign decision. You can find the links there where you can reference the direct quotes by these IMF officials. I also wrote a piece recently that was published by the Financial Times called "Why SDR Should Be Used by States and Not Central Banks." And I invite you to check it out because there's the legal basis for countries, for governments to include SDRs in their budgets and not just keep them in central bank reserves. As I present in the piece, you can do actually both. You can have them initially as government resources, have them then be deposited at the central banks, and then Treasury can use them for fiscal purposes, as we will see later. Now, this is not something new. This is not something radical. This is something that has been done in the past. In the 2009 SDR issuance, there are many countries in the world that did use them for fiscal purposes. A review by the US Treasury Department with IMF data showed that Ecuador, Bosnia, Moldova, Serbia, Ukraine, Mauritania, and Zimbabwe did use them for fiscal purposes in the past. I'm talking about 12 years ago. And at the international level, there is nothing that forbids countries to use SDRs for fiscal purposes, such as the case that the US, Canada, and the UK, the owner of the SDRs, is not the central bank, but the Ministry of Finance or the Treasury as it corresponds. Here's an example of what Ecuador did last time while I was at the central bank, which is why I'm telling you this story. Now, In this issuance, the one that was done 2 months ago, almost exactly, we have monitored with the Sbrs how the SDRs have been used. And we don't have all of the information, but I have gathered the Latin American experiences from meetings with authorities and press reviews, and also the SDR data that Mark mentioned that IMF publishes. Paraguay, Ecuador, and Argentina gave them full fiscal use. They decreed, either by law or by executive decree, that the SDRs belong to the governments before going to the central banks. And that is how they were incorporated into the government budgets. Additionally, other countries in the region, including Colombia and Mexico, but also Argentina, used internal central bank treasury financing. You won't find Colombia and Mexico having a drop in SDRs because they did basically accounting within the domestic institutions, and they created more fiscal space by basically doing internal financing and keeping the SDRs at the central banks, but having the central banks finance money to the treasuries. We have other countries in the region like Antigua and Barbuda, Guyana, and Haiti that have exchanged their SDRs for dollars, but we don't know if they've used it for fiscal purposes. And we have a case of Trinidad and Tobago that actually received extra SDRs, most likely the first loan of SDRs in this new era. Here's an example from Paraguay on the law they issued to transfer SDRs to the government budget. Now, there are a few accounting implications and transparency implications on SDRs for fiscal purposes. If SDRs are exchanged or used to pay the IMF, such as the case of Argentina, when Mark showed the large drop in Argentina, in this case, no other country bought the SDRs from them, but it was used to increase the IMF's account at the SDR department because they were being paid back. Argentina was paying back the loan they got from the IMF with SDRs. But these net movements will show in the monthly SDR holdings data published by the IMF. Unfortunately, this is as far as we can get regarding the international-based transparency of SDRs. Now, if SDRs are accounted in central banks' balance sheets, they must comply with the IMF's data dissemination standard as reserve asset holdings. But this does not include how the SDRs are used for transactions. Furthermore, central banks can swap SDRs with the hard currency they already had in their balance sheet for other uses, such as the case of Mexico or Colombia, right? If we don't monitor those countries, we wouldn't know that they actually used the SDR leverage to use hard currency. And as we all know, central banks are less transparent than government budgets, especially in the developing world. Now, if SDRs are allocated to government budgets, they must comply with budget laws, which generally include transparency requirements. There are standards around the world as to how budgets have to be accountable to people, to institutions. Spending must follow participatory process, parliamentary processes, administrative processes, and procurement processes, which include the oversight. So this establishes much more transparency for citizens, civil society, and in general for countries, right? Furthermore, the priority spending of SDRs can be decided collectively. And of course, civil society understands budgets much better than central banks' balance sheets, which have been more opaque and more difficult to understand for people. It is important to remember that there are mechanisms to make this happen. There are perfectly legal ways to transfer the SDRs from the central banks to the government. I won't go into the details. I invite you to read the handbook. Just to remember, it is not forbidden to use them for fiscal purposes. Developing countries do need more fiscal space, so please take advantage of this. There will be a better use for them than the central bank's balance sheets. They are more transparent if they are on the government budgets, and there is a way to get this done. So approach us or read the manual, or we're definitely willing to help anybody around the world to get this to occur. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andres, for these remarks. It's very interesting on the potential use of SDRs to support social spending, and we have seen actually in the past couple of weeks countries that have committed to clarify what SDR could be used for. And it includes health spending. We've seen countries use that for COVID vaccines, even manufacturing, but also infrastructure projects. And it seems from Mark's remark that SDR can be better suited for covering imports or external spending, but can also, by doing so, free up resources that were allocated in the first place to the budget. And this is an important point for CSOs to take to their government as they discuss priorities for the forthcoming budgets. Which gives me a good segue to introduce Janet Zhou, who's the Executive Director of the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZIMCOD, who's a close partner to the AFRODAD, African Network on Debt and Development. And they've both been strong proponents for the involvement of civil society on the SDR debate. So Janet will walk us through what SDR mean for African countries and how they've been working with other partners to further this agenda. Over to you, Janet. Thank you. Janet, you're on mute, I think.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Adele, and thank you to the organizers for giving us an opportunity to be on this table where we are discussing the issues around policy and to do with the SDR following the major impacts of COVID-19, both as a health crisis, but for us in Africa, it was also a social and an economic crisis, which really threw people off the balance to a point that most people who were impacted at a social and economic level are not going to be able to bounce back. And I'm speaking of such sectors as the informal sector because of the hard lockdowns, the tourism sector in some parts of Africa not going to be able to bounce back post-COVID-19. So the issue of SDRs is a very close to Africa issue in terms of one of those mechanisms that is supposed to build once again the issue of fiscal space for most African countries that were already reeling in pre-existing issues like the debt crisis, debt distress, but also economic recessions. For example, if you're talking about South Africa, you're talking about Zimbabwe and many other African countries. So it was going to be very difficult, and it has been very difficult for them to respond to COVID-19. So as civil society organizations and movements in Africa, in this part of the region, with the advent of COVID-19 and realizing the impact this was going to have, based of course on the pandemic itself, but the many structural and systemic challenges that Africa was already facing, as I have said, when it comes to trading, when it comes to the issue of debt, and the positioning within the global economy, the asymmetry relationships. It was going to be very difficult for Africa to respond to COVID-19 or to recover from COVID-19. And as African CSOs, like I said, the message initially was that a call for a moratorium on debt repayments so that the resources that were targeted at repaying debts to the creditors could now focus on saving lives within the COVID-19 context, but livelihoods as well, because most of our economies are informal economies. And I think we saw the response from the creditors around the debt moratorium. There was also a call from the civil society for the halting of interest accumulation on debts and arrears, which I think was a major issue, especially for those countries that were already in debt distress. And we saw, for example, Zambia, which has qualified before under the HIPIC, failing to service its debt and its arrears. And that was one of the big red flags and an example that we kept on using in terms of engaging as civil society organizations, but at the African Union level as well. We pushed for unconditional debt cancellation, which has been the discourse for the debt justice movement in the South and in the North when we are doing our collaborations. And we're saying this is the time to consider the issue of debt cancellation, unconditional debt cancellation. And when we are talking about the unconditional debt cancellation, we'll be talking about not putting conditions, for example, reducing on social spending, austerity measures and the like, and saying let's actually create more space for our countries to be able to respond to the crisis and not impose austerity measures and conditions that will reduce social spending or social investments where they are needed the most. We also called for non-debt-inducing mechanisms or interventions, and one of them that we pushed for was the issue of the SDRs, which we really engaged on and held hands and connected and said this is the time, because at the government's level there was dissonance with some countries skeptical about the issuance of SDRs, in particular, as we know, based on governance issues, on the politics around it, whether dictators were going to make use of those SDRs to continue to repress and to finance bad governance, so to speak. But as civil society said, this was an opportunity to really consider this. The radical one was on the debt strikes at the African level. If all failed, say we may as well stop, so that all the resources that we intended to use for debt repayments, we then can use to respond to COVID-19. There was the issue of the grants and debt swaps from creditors as well, which some countries and some creditors, actually like Germany as an example, do have, when we're saying maybe this is an opportunity to also consider the debt swaps for the social sector and to respond to COVID-19. But the accountability mechanism was also key for the African civil society organizations, as we kept on talking, because we know our governance, our public finance management systems and how porous they are and susceptible they are to corruption. And we're talking about the central banks, and we know the opacity and lack of transparency within the central banks. And the IMF, of course, issued the guidelines, and we engaged on the guidelines with the central banks, with Parliament, to see the oversight role of Parliament and the like. So I just wanted to then highlight the three troubles that we have, that we believe that as Africa, SDRs will become meaningful if they are targeted. One, at reducing extreme poverty, which has increased significantly. We're going to see about 39 million Africans actually in extreme poverty in 2021. The widening inequalities as well is a big issue, and it goes as well even to the issue of access to vaccines by African countries, issues around health access, education access within COVID-19 and the like. The third issue, which is a twin trouble, a pre-existing issue for African countries, was the unemployment rates that we also need to be addressing. We have the social spending there, which most African countries have not been able to meet in terms of the thresholds, their protocols that they've actually set. The health 15%, education 20%, water, which is critical in COVID-19 at 15%. Most African countries had not been able to meet this, and the SDR, we believe, if it is targeted and the issue of social spending is prioritized, it can go to cover some of these issues. I would not want to leave out the issue of the informal sector and what impact the SDR could also have, because Africa GDP, about 80% of the labor force in sub-Saharan Africa is actually in the informal sector, and we need to be considering in terms of how do we build the infrastructure, how do we build the system for the informal sector to be cushioned and hedged from the challenges that they are facing. The debt levels, I will not belabor much on that, but that was a pre-existing issue, which is why we made the call and what it means to then have an SDR and not a debt-inducing framework, because most of the countries in Africa, if you look, they're either in debt distress or they're at a very high risk, and only a few are in the low risk of being in debt distress, if you look at that. So I think that is mainly the context that we are coming in from. And I will conclude by talking about, of course, the internal issues as we focus on the management of the SDR. One is the crisis in the end of the state of most African states in terms of economic models, in terms of developmental models and rights respecting economies. This has been lacking and there are deficits there, and we have to deal with some of those issues to ensure that we salvage the endangered future, which is the climate, the food, the finance, and where most youth, women, people with disabilities and the like are found. I will rush through to the usage, which I think most of the speakers before me have spoken about, to which as civil society in Africa and as a debt justice movement, one of the key issues that we've been pushing for is that the SDRs must be used for fiscal purposes in kind of multi-year framework, budget frameworks to fund social services and infrastructure, which is not there. And this will enable our governments to be able to respond to the triple problems of poverty, of inequalities, and of unemployment that we have spoken about. It will also give that fiscal relief from the tensions between spending and fiscal consolidation and austerity that our governments have always been pushing for, and also with the assistance from the international financial institutions, creating a problem within the structural problems that have to be dealt with at the international level at some point. We hope that the SDR has key principles that have to be followed in terms of not debt inducing, no conditionalities, linking issues of debt justice to climate justice, issues of transparency and accountability, access by middle income countries, and also ensuring that we build our own financing agency. I think that is also a really key issue that has to be dealt with as we build our domestic resource mobilization, our investment framework, our public finance management framework, and our industrial and trade policies. These would then support our post-COVID-19 recovery. But the SDR was one of those mechanisms that we push for, and we hope that it can create that fiscal space to spend for the social services, for social security, for cushioning, and also the infrastructure, because at the moment, the citizens are not enjoying most of their rights within the COVID-19. And these are some of the challenges that I just want to close with. We have a crisis. Those are doctors on the right that I'm putting. They were demonstrating that they actually love this is in Zimbabwe, their patients, and they want to work, but they cannot work. They don't have the tools of trade. People are having their houses demolished as an example. Water, which is important within, and actually has got a threshold. People fetch their water in unsafe sources, and those are graduates, which is a movement of graduates that are not employed, that have to be employed, that also need. So we need to be thinking about some of these as examples in terms of how the SDR can be used to alleviate these challenges that already existed, but that have to be attended to as they have been exacerbated by COVID-19. There's a lot of resource on our website, on the AfroDad website, on the Jubilee UK, and many other debt justice movements that Latin Dad that we have been working with to raise awareness amongst the citizens around what SDRs are, raising awareness and oversight and representative role of parliaments, and also engaging with the executive in terms of ministries of finance and economic development planning to ensure that there is national dialogues that are going on around the SDR, in particular to their use, but also on how we can be monitoring to ensure that there is transparency and there is accountability in the use of SDRs for them to make sense. But of course, we are also pushing at the international level to say there are long-term issues that we need to deal with. Does the quota system in terms of allocation work? Because as we know, African countries got 5% of the SDRs. Is that the route that we want to take? What mechanism can bring equity based on the needs that each country has, and particularly the least income countries? So those are issues that we have been pushing for, and I will share some of the links in the chat box in terms of deliberations that have so far gone on. Thank you very much, and I hand over back the mic to you, Claire.
Great. No, thank you so much, Janet. You've provided sort of broader economic framing on the continent, and of course the very real consequences and implications in Zimbabwe and other African countries. Thank you for sharing the links and also reinforcing the importance of transparency and accountability. We've been seeing these messages in the chat as well, that we have monthly SDR data for holdings, but not transactions. There's not enough information on how these SDRs are being used and to which domestic institutions those SDRs are being allocated. So we just wanted to share a quick poll on that as well, in terms of coming back to that question of transparency. The poll is coming up now. And so please feel free to share, how transparent is the government about the use of SDRs in your country? The government has not published nor said anything. The government has announced how SDRs will be used. The government has invited civic inputs. So again, we're seeing that quite a lack of information on and opportunities to engage on how SDRs are being used. And so thanks so much for sharing that. Although, it seems to be one place where civic inputs have been invited. So we definitely want to encourage more of that, sharing the results here. Thanks so much. So let's keep the questions and reflections flowing in the chat, please. We're very happy to hear from you. We're also now going to hear from Panina Mambazi from the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, Siatini, in Uganda. Again, Siatini has been sort of at the forefront of some of these debt and aid and justice, fiscal justice issues. And we're going to hear more about how the campaign and advocacy efforts are going in Uganda, and how we can promote more accountability in the use of SDRs there. Over to you, Panina.
Thank you so much. Happy to be part of this engagement, and I'm very sure it's coming at a time that is very, very important. This debate of SDRs, in times when a country like Uganda and other countries, developing countries, are struggling to see how to spend within what they already have, but are also incurring a lot of debt. And it's bringing a lot of debate on how best these SDRs can be used. I like to go straight to the presentation. First and foremost, Uganda, just as any other country, is an IMF member country. And already we received $490 for the SDRs, equivalent to 1.7 trillion Uganda shillings. And already, as we know, most of it has come at a time where we have gone through a lot of challenges with the COVID-19. And there's been a lot of debate here on how best these SDRs can be utilized. Alternatives have been to keep these resources as reserves at the central bank for them to play an important role into the monetary policy purposes, and basically to boost into the balance of payments, as well as help with the smooth flow of imports and exports. Secondly, is to see that they are channeled into budget support. And already we know that through already challenges that we're faced with having the country incur a lot of debt, we are quite skeptical on how best these SDRs can go into the right way of being spent. And currently they come in a time when, like I said, most of it is going into high expenditures for government rather than into social welfare. A lot is being spent more into less into battling even for making sure that we have enough vaccines that could be really essential for most citizens, as well as for access to health services, access to education now being done online, since most of school children haven't yet resumed going back to school. So we feel that there's a way that this can be channeled more into budget support than to the central banks. Second slide. Can go. And right now, our major concerns are limited transparency, because already we know for the time that we have received a lot of money in terms of debt, it has come to a notice that most of these finances are not actually published and actually not transparently put out there by government. And we fear that this will be the same thing for the SDRs. And we know that when proper and transparent use of these resources, most of it will be able to at least should be able to involve key stakeholders like civil society, parliament, media, to be able to see how best these resources are utilized. And we feel that there's been a big discretion on how these resources are going to be utilized by the central bank, and has been left to a few technocrats, mainly in the Ministry of Finance and central bank itself. Secondly, risk of prioritization of debt repayment versus recovery efforts. Like I already said earlier, most of, at least our biggest worry is that already we have incurred a lot of debt. And while Uganda may still be not at a high risk at the moment, we still believe it comes back to bite us in the long run, because we cannot see a lot of the resources that are being given to us into social welfare. Currently, Uganda has spent already over 4.7 trillion shillings into interest payments. That is already taking a big chunk out of the national budget. And that is putting a lot of pressure on the citizens, because a lot of pressure is being put on taxes for us to pay taxes. And already we are failing to see that most of these are coming out to benefit us into social services, into how best already the country can pull back from recovering from COVID, the situations with the COVID hitting the economy. And that's the biggest challenge at the moment. So a lot of risk in management of this SDRs is our problem, is what we're looking at. And already we know that most times countries already that are such as developing countries have been put into a small box on how resources being given or channeled from the IMF or other creditors, making it very limiting for the government to be able to look at other ways of actually ensuring that citizens do receive most of the social welfare and social welfare services. And from this side of Uganda, we see that most times already we're having challenges with being able to complete even the vaccinations. Why? Because most of the time from the beginning, it was more emphasis put on how best the country can stabilize financially, the liquidity that was not there in the beginning when the COVID happened. And this is the right time to now reprioritize and structure well how best now citizens can be able to gain from having now such money coming, SDRs coming into the economy. Next slide. Our other concern is systematic unfairness within the current global financial systematic unfairness within the current global financial system. And why we're looking at this is because already we know that a big chunk already was given out to bigger economies as well, USA and China, leaving small economies to struggle. And USA already received $113.4 billion. And this is 5 times what was allocated to 24 low-income countries. And we are already seeing that this is unfair. And it is, we call upon at least for equitable and fair distribution of these SDRs. At the time, we know that a lot of bigger economies may not be in need of using these SDRs. They can rechannel them to be able to at least meet the needs of us low-income countries, and be able to also see that while they give us this responsibility to take on these SDRs, they're able to also allow us to do proper monitoring and evaluation on how best they're used, transparency on how open and information is being circulated about these SDRs and how well they're being utilized. From our side as Siatini, we have done a lot of campaigns regarding the SDRs. We have met, we have been able to meet with a lot of stakeholders in ensuring that at least our position is put out there. Press conferences regarding how best we can be able to channel this information to bring up one core voice against the misuse of such finances. Next slide. So here we see is our advocacy on SDRs. Like I said, we've had a lot of different initiatives were taken into consideration, such as the press conferences, and also working together with other CSOs to be able to collaborate and have one clear voice, both nationally, regionally, and globally. We have worked with partners such as Afrodad, Eurodad, as well as also being part of a number of signatories when it came to campaigns against upon rechanneling of these SDRs. One that was led by Latindad, where we have also been able to make sure that we push it into channeling this information to the public through press releases, different ways with the use of media as a core ally in our advocacy. We are continuing to engage with members of parliament, as well as also look at also engaging with IMF to make sure that while they are going to distribute these SDRs, they should be also entitled to ensuring that they put government at a point where they can ask for proper transparency, not only on their side as IMF to produce how these SDRs will be disseminated, but also on our side from government to be able to actually transparently put this information either in newspapers, whether it is in the website, where we can easily access it to know that it is being spent and for the right reason. Yes, next slide. So as part of this, we also have our recommendations. We know that SDRs are not entirely to be done only by central bank, but it should be also having other actors such as parliament, civil society, and government itself to be able to work together to ensure that we can actually get proper value for money when it comes to how well those resources will be spent. Already, Uganda itself is already highly indebted to about 7 trillion Uganda shillings. And this is already putting a lot of pressure on different aspects in regard to social welfare, but also to paying taxes that are a bit going to be, they're going to really be a challenge to the common citizens. And this, we actually advocating to make sure that while these SDRs are going to be able to hopefully be rechanneled to budget support, there's need for us to play a bigger role as key actors. So our recommendations go first to government. We're looking at Bank of Uganda being a central bank here in Uganda. And we believe that should the exchange of these resources be in any currency. They should be at least targeted to budget support. Why? Because already interest payment is taking a huge toll on us already in our budget, and already we see that that is actually putting government in a small box to be able to make sure that some of those resources can be channeled to social welfare. Prioritization of utilization of these funds should be placed on vaccines and critical medical and protective equipment, as well as it injecting back into the real economy, as well as supporting micro and smaller enterprises to provide for adequate social welfare support. And we see that a lot has changed given the fact that already COVID-19 happened. We're seeing a total change in the way the economy is running. A lot of emphasis should be put into the informal sector, because we cannot keep on borrowing. We cannot keep on relying on external financing. We should be able to know that we can be able to revive the economy domestically, and also ensure that a lot of our social welfare is met with regard to how best these funds are going to be utilized. Next, central bank should be able to hold dialogues with civil society, parliament, and the general public to be able to create a transparent utilization and management of these resources. A lot has been put into description of how these SDRs are going to be able to be managed, and we believe it is at this time it's very critical for the public to be actually part of this this kind of issues, because already we see also for them as government, we already stand a high chance of being able to use these resources to the best. However, it is easier to be able to pull on stakeholders that will be able to even help it much better, and to make sure that utilization and management resources is put as a critical point. And especially coming from the open budget survey that was held in 2019, we looked and saw that already citizen participation did not score so highly. We got 14% as a country, but yet we already seen to be the best in East Africa. This kind of also would be the best time for government to make sure that at this time, critical as it is, there's a lot of engagement with key actors in ensuring there's transparent utilization and management of these resources. Bank of Uganda should publish periodic reports on the use of resources. We need to see more of these reports come out, because at least for us to see value for money, where we can be able to know that from the SDRs that came in, we're able to know to have proper projects done, people able to access proper health care, people able to access, students able to access education, best quality education, and be able to know that while we're also already trying to carve down on our appetite to borrow, we can be able to find a way to make sure that we have more returns in investment coming in from the way we will properly use these resources. Also, newly acquired SDRs, we believe, should not be used for repayment of debt or to creditors. This is already what I had mentioned earlier. We're looking at this going into budget support more, because right now we need it to at least channel down to the people in different ways, such as social welfare services. And Uganda government should seek debt relief from her creditors at this time where debt is a big topic, rechanneling and finding ways of refinancing these developing economies. We believe at this point, a lot of these resources need to be saved to fight the pandemic, as well as also improve a lot of structures regarding how best our economy is trying to thrive COVID-19. Bank of Uganda and Ministry of Finance should clearly have a legal framework that will be followed in the management and use of the SDRs. We need to really have a framework that will guide us. Already we have the Public Finance Management Act that has been on and is being actually reviewed to make a lot of amendments when it comes to the extractive industry, as well as also looking at how other frameworks that could be possibly come in to make sure that such SDRs are not mishandled, not mismanaged as well when it comes to them entering into the economy. The central bank and Ministry of Finance should prioritize a comprehensive report to account for the utilization of these allocations that were received from IMF. And we believe it's their role really to be able to make sure that these reports account properly and give a transparent overview of how these resources are utilized. Yes, Parliament as another actor, we believe they have a very important role that they should play. And we see that they need to be able to play their oversight role to ensure that these funds are used prudently and are also used for the right things. Because already we see that as an arm of government, they have also had to be armed with the right information, which us as civil society can do. We can be able to give them the right information or even more information that could help them be able to table a lot of these things on the floor of Parliament. Like I said earlier, we have gone ahead to push our advocacy by being able to meet with a number of different members of Parliament, as well as be on committees that try to make sure that these parliamentarians actually do have more information and are armed enough to be able to demand for proper utilization of such resources. Next. Civil society as an actor, we should be able to engage Parliament, just as I was explaining, and the general public, their awareness on these resources that they need to be able to use properly. And this is something that is ongoing. It can never stop. You have to keep on engaging. We have to keep on engaging as Siatini and other CSOs here in Uganda. That's what we've been doing. And we should be able to engage on the need for critical systematic reform of the IMF and World Bank governance to ensure global equity. And this is mainly on how exactly global debt and the financial architecture remains largely tilted in favor of advanced economies. And we're looking at developing countries that are struggling at this time to make sure that they are able to meet a lot of their loan obligations and are able to keep their credit rating when it comes to being able to borrow more money from a lot of these creditors, being both concessional and non-concessional. And we feel that there's a need for IMF and World Bank to be able to come on board and ensure that there's global equity to how best these SDRs are distributed and also how best we can manage them as developing countries. Next. And we also are pushing to advocate for a fairer distribution formula. Like I've said, how SDRs can be properly distributed to the most vulnerable economies. Currently, we're working closely with AfroDad and Eurodad and other stakeholders to be able to have a collective advocacy on having these SDRs properly rechanneled and ensuring that we hold government also accountable to have proper transparency to its best. Our last also is to our development partners such as IMF. We need to see that they support transparency efforts on the proper utilization of the SDR resources and other loan resources to enable citizens to easily monitor them. And we know that already as from their side of lending a lot of money to Uganda, we know that they can be able to have a way of pushing for government to have to ensure proper utilization of these resources, as well as publishing more of this information out there to reach the public. Currently, we do not have a debt registrar as a country. Most of the information regarding debt is usually from different documents that are put out by Ministry of Finance, but it would be good that we can be able to go either to our website, access this information on how many loans or maybe how many SDR resources are being utilized currently, not only for having to go to IMF website to access this information. And this will make it easier for us to engage also as civil society when it comes to having these meetings with them. IMF should encourage Uganda to take advantage of different initiatives, such as the G20 debt service suspension. And we believe that such initiatives can put less strain on Uganda having to borrow a lot of money, as well as also the debt stress already that most countries are facing. Currently, like I said, we're already indebted by 70 trillion. And this is putting a lot of financial pressure when it comes to how best services are reaching most of the people in this country. IMF should not push Uganda to implement further austerity measures for recovery. And we feel that this is coming in a time, like I said, it's post-COVID, and we want to see that the country can be able to recover without having to put a lot of pressure on conditionalities on how best the country should utilize some of the loans that they have received, but also on making sure that they are equitable and transparent when it comes to actually distributing these SDRs. We therefore wish to note that unless the above concerns and recommendations address newly allocated SDRs in Uganda might fail to play their intended role of financing the fight against the pandemic, and also to drive a just, green, and fair post-COVID-19 recovery. So we want to see a better way most of these resources can be properly utilized, and also taking part on a lot has changed in regard to how debt is being already incurred from most countries. We want to be able to see that we can be able to turn over a new leaf and be able to actually see that most of these resources are properly utilized. In case of any need to check out our position paper, well, there's a link there from which takes you straight to the organization, Fiatini, and you can be able to find other information, other policy briefs, as well as statements that we have put out there to champion this advocacy on SDRs. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Very powerful messages about how these decisions shouldn't fit squarely with a few technocrats, and we all have a role to play. Very clear recommendations for us all on how to promote equity and accountability in the use of SDRs. We have some great questions coming in the chat, as well as the Q&A. So I do want to read these out and then field them to our respective speakers. So we have a question from Bob here in the chat about how publicly available is information about the voluntary exchange of SDRs by richer countries to help the poorest, those most in need, givers and recipients, if happening. We've received a question as well in the chat or the Q&A here about how can we square the difficulty with using SDRs for domestic spending, as laid out by Mark, with calls for supporting SMMEs, and social welfare spending, for example, in Uganda, as called for by Fiatini. So how can we ensure that these funds are used for fiscal space and social spending? We also have a question from Rob. Even with conversations of rechanneling getting traction, will traditional mechanisms be used to rechannel these SDRs at the expense of ODI and commitments to climate financing, for instance? So again, important questions here around ensuring that these funds are contributing to important development goals. And of course, we've had interesting discussions in the chat as well about ensuring that these funds aren't used for debt repayment. So would be interested to hear from speakers and other participants today about those questions as well. So perhaps, Mark, we can turn to you about some of these questions here about squaring some of those difficulties that you highlighted around using the SDRs and ensuring that they are spent towards important goals like social spending in the respective countries, and any other of those questions that you wish to address as well.
Sure, thank you, Claire. If you look at the developed countries, in their response to COVID, they had a very expansionary monetary policy. Essentially, many developed countries printed money in order to boost economic activity and keep the economy alive. Countries that were more vulnerable to the shocks weren't able to do that. Middle income and lower income countries didn't have that flexibility. And the SDRs can give them that flexibility, in fact. They can allow the country to, in some sense, print money to boost the economy that may lay dormant. The important thing is that they not print too much money, that they not use those SDRs and convert them into too many domestic resources, and thereby induce inflation now. And you can see, in fact, if you look at the developed countries in the world, there are some fears that excess monetary activity has resulted in inflation. So I think it's possible that the SDRs can be used to prompt more economic activity. It just has to be done carefully. And I think in some ways it frees up government resources to, as I said before, to import more things. The resources that were going to be used for those imports can then be used for other things. So it's possible to do it, but it has to be done prudently with an attention to the overall health of the economy.
Great. No, thanks so much.
Sure.
Andres, perhaps we can hear a bit more from you on some of these questions as well, and including on how publicly available is information, both on how little we know about how these SDRs are going to be used, about the transactions, about the domestic institutions, but some of the rechanneling points as well. So Andres, over to you, please.
So I'd like to start with the rechanneling ideas. This is perhaps the least transparent of the discussions that are being taken place around the world. And it's the discussions basically between the rich countries. Unfortunately, there's a lot of discussion about rich countries trying to use the SDRs donations as part of their official development assistance, which would basically eliminate all of the development assistance in the past, because the amount of SDRs that would be rechanneled are very large. Unfortunately, the predominant position seems to be that they do not want to donate SDRs, but rather to on-lend them via IMF instruments, which would imply more debt, more conditionality, more austerity, because that's ingrained and that's part of the IMF sort of toolkit. Unfortunately, sure, we can have some caveats there, but in general, that's what's probably going to happen. Furthermore, middle-income countries would be largely excluded from these arrangements. Now, there are alternatives to this. I mean, the countries can issue, you know, a one-time sort of budget flexibilities to start considering SDRs as part of the you know, extraordinary fiscal framework that was applied during the pandemic, but in this case, taking into account the rest of the world, the global south, and developing countries' needs. And that could help alleviate the needs that developing countries have in terms of access to resources, both for balance of payments and for fiscal purposes. But like I said, this is perhaps the least of the transparent, the least transparent of all the discussions around SDRs. And we hope that we can put some pressure on rich countries' policies regarding that as well. Now, regarding developing countries and how they channel SDRs from central banks to the government, the most timely decision would have been, and I'm saying this almost as a wishful thinking of the past, if governments took action before August 23rd, so that the SDRs would have been directly allocated to governments, and then governments had, you know, the leverage to decide how the central bank would intervene, what the central bank's role would have been. However, unfortunately, very few governments took action before August 23rd, and by default, the SDRs have been assigned as reserves to the central banks. Now, after a couple of decades of central bank independent paradigm, the central banks are usually much more reticent to let go of reserve assets once it's on their balance sheet. So it probably requires either legislative action or a very open mind from central bankers, right? And this is where I think I can come to help, because I was at the central bank when we were in charge of the 2009 issuance in my country, and we were able to have an open mind about this. We read the treaties, the Articles of Agreement of the IMF, we read our domestic laws, and we found the way to act accordingly without violating any international standards and fully complying with domestic law to make this happen. Now is a good time to consider this, because most countries of the world, the budget is being defined around these dates, right? For the 2022 budget. And usually budgets are accompanied by a budget law or by certain reforms as part of the efforts. So this is a good opportunity to include legislative mandates so that the SDRs can be at least shared, if not transferred, to the governments, so that we can design the financial engineering or the financial accounting so that they can be put to best use in each of the countries. It is not a simple issue, but it does have a simple solution if there is political will and there is a civil society that's empowered, that understands what these things are, and that there's a benefit that's due to collect.
Great, thanks so much, Andres. Again, important points there about how we can ensure that solutions towards some of these issues and the roles that we can play on legislative action, and analyzing those treaties and domestic laws and leverage those for social spending. So thanks so much. Jenna, over to you in terms of some of these questions that come up, these questions around debt repayments, ensuring that SDRs are effectively used and adequately or transparently and accountably used. Any further thoughts on the questions that have come up and Andres's key points of how we can go forward?
Thank you very much, Claire. I think there was a question in terms of the debt movement as well, to which I think there has been quite a number of convenings at the regional block level. For example, at the SADC level, we have been convening under the Southern Africa People's Solidarity Network, where we've been convening social movements to raise awareness on the SDR amongst the citizens. So we have held webinars and meetings around the SDRs at the regional level, and then at the national levels as well for the citizens and for civil society organizations. We have held dialogue meetings as well at the national levels, convening with the region in terms of the debt movements to learn and to share experiences from different countries with our parliaments and our parliamentarians to enhance that oversight role. Because I think what we're talking about here is really, there is skepticism in terms of transparency and accountability in the utilization of the SDR, particularly when given the role of the central banks. But I think it has been very clear here that this does not only have to be between the international financial institutions or the IMF and the central banks, so to speak, but it should be open enough, and there must be a transparent and a working monitoring mechanism where civil society organizations and other interested stakeholders like business should be involved as well in terms of pointing to where the SDR should be used. So those are convenings we have held with debt justice movements in the different countries. There's been the African Debt Conference, which was convened as well and led by Aphrodite as an example. We have been linking with other partners from the global north, as I indicated. Latin debt is produced quite a lot. Jubilee UK, Jubilee Germany, and those are some of those debt justice movements that we have been working with in terms of raising awareness, but also engaging with the creditors, engaging with our governments on the SDR. It is a very complex issue, and the issue of capacity of the citizens, but of also the accountability institutions like Parliament is going to be tested by the issue of the SDRs, because there is always, conflicting information in terms of exactly what they are, what they can be used for, and the opacity around how they're going to be used. So there is need to continue to engage on these issues and to raise awareness. But I just wanted to conclude by saying that I think we have had a conversation before where we were saying our countries, especially in Africa, we still need to implement economic reforms that put people at the center and have developmental economic models that put the citizen at the center, the community at the center, and build capacities for resilience, but also capacities to be able to be empowered to play the oversight role. So the reforms that still have to happen, and the SDRs must not substitute those reforms around oversight, around curbing illicit financial flows, ensuring that we harness our domestic resources and we build our own African financing agency for our development. And we can link this to the Sustainable Development Goals as an example. I just wanted to highlight that I think as we move forward, the SDR must be building our financing agency and must be utilized to ensure that we are giving that agency and in our economies and to our governments and to the citizens as well, in terms of provision of social services, but also of infrastructure. Thank you, Claire.
Great. Now, Penina, just quickly over to you for any final. I know we have some questions specifically about Uganda. Of course, we'll be providing more information about each country. But Penina, over to you about any sort of brief closing remarks on some of the questions around these transparency and accountability aspects.
Thank you. I'm actually happy to see that a lot of feedback is coming in the section, especially from different participants. More so, especially when it comes to for Uganda, I believe, and also other developing countries, I believe there's a need for inclusive economic growth to ensure that every citizen has at least has been able to be part of such different engagements with government, to ensure that a lot of the information that is put out there is actually channeled, not only left to the technocrats, but also left to the people, to the general public, to make sure that a lot of these decisions that are to be made are not made only by government, but also by the people. And I believe for just out from a lot of engagement that we have to do in our own countries, but also looking at how best to globally also have to be part of such initiatives when it comes to saying no to poor usage of SDRs, or saying no to how resources are being underutilized or no transparency. That is a big, put a big, at least a big demand from different citizens and also globally, to ensure that most of these resources are prudently utilized and used for the right purposes. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So as we turn to Adil for closing remarks, we'll do one last poll to get your sense of how the discussion has gone today. Thanks so much. Adil, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks all the panelists and participants for your engagement. And you can tell from this conversation that there's really energy and interest in taking this conversation forward. The polls have shown there is clearly an accountability gap regarding SDRs, with 65% of attendees recognizing their governments have not published nor said anything about SDRs, and only 3% of government inviting public inputs. So there's a gap, and I think we've established that amongst participants. And more broadly, and this is the second intent of this event, we also hope this is the beginning of a conversation rather than an endpoint. We've heard about CIT's experience in leveraging press conferences, media channels, including social media, press releases, but also engaging with members of parliament and the IMF, reviewing periodic reports on the use of SDRs. So there's work to be done. And we recognize that many CSOs around here have experience to share And 4% of you have actually said that they actually actively engaged on the topic. So there's a lot of more experience to learn, and time is not enough for us to cover all this individually. So we hope this connection can be established and can be opportunities to get inspirations from how different CSOs foster a national dialogue around the use of SDRs and potentially initiate a collective advocacy effort. So we hope you're able to connect with one another, including with speakers, and we're always happy to facilitate some of those linkages. Lastly, and I'm probably speaking on behalf of all participants, we want to reiterate the importance of having more voices participate in country dialogues on how SDRs are used, and this requires government to be transparent and inclusive about SDR decision making. So thank you again, all of you, for your engagement and contribution today. We will be making available the recording of the event in 3 languages, and we'll be also sharing presentations and also publishing a blog in the coming days. So stay tuned. Thanks all.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.